Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to Politics in the Pub right here at Uni Pub on level 3. As always, once a month. Please, if you're up the back, please come up, make yourself comfortable in range. My name is Tom. I'm a researcher at the Australia Institute, working on a range of issues, including recently on higher education policy and funding. I'm very pleased to be introducing a speaker on this issue tonight. But first, we'll just introduce the topic and speaker for the next month's Politics in the Pub. Doctor's Dream, a story of hope from the top end, an inspiring journey to the heart of partnership with Dr. Bhuti Lokuge. He is a public health official, a physician, author and co-founder of Every Voice Counts, a social enterprise organisation that designs people-focused programs and promotes change for healthier, happier communities. He's worked as a doctor in Afghanistan, Africa and the US for Médecins Sans Frontières and in remote communities in Northern Australia. So please come along to that. To find out who is speaking at Politics in the Pub and also to receive behind the lines and other newsletters that we send out, please sign up. There are clipboards that will be sort of travelling around the audience. Please sign up there. I actually just wrote something today on higher education funding, which if you sign up today, you'll receive in your inbox soon. But to introduce our speaker tonight, is an academic, administrator, legal scholar and lawyer with an expansive career global around Australia and right here in Canberra. He's been the Vice Chancellor of the University of Canberra since 2007. Prior to that, he was a Senior Deputy Vice Chancellor of Monash and then the Dean and Professor of Law at Monash and Professor of Law at Griffith, as well as serving on various quality agencies, higher education quality agencies. As a legal scholar, he has works in marriage and family law, civil procedure, legal ethics, children's rights, and a textbook designed to help people who work in law or study law see how other disciplines see law, which is something that economics could really do with a bit more of. As well as that, he is a barrister and solicitor at the Supreme Court of the ACT and holds positions in the Supreme Court of Queensland and New South Wales. And despite his British accent, he has been in Australia for 26 years. Most recently, he is known, of course, for his strident opposition to the current proposals to deregulate university fees. So without further ado, Professor Stephen Parker.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. I should say I spent 6 years here at the ANU in Canberra, which is where I moved to from the United Kingdom. One of my children was born here, and I feel a real connection to Canberra and also to the ANU, even though I may not be entirely generous to them tonight. So thank you for inviting me to speak. It's good to have contact with the Australia Institute. It's my first contact. It's actually my first time in Unipub as well, so it's an experience for me. And yesterday afternoon, my daughter asked me, would I do the ice water bucket challenge? So I thought, which is about raising money for motor neurone disease, I thought I might do it at the end of this, but Unipub won't allow it on the basis that water is a health and safety issue. So given what's being sold, as you know, my topic tonight is higher education reforms. I won't beat about the bush. I oppose the higher education reforms lock, stock and barrel. And I'll return to the word barrel at the end of my talk, noting that the expression is about a gun or rifle. I think I'm the only Vice-Chancellor to oppose the reforms in toto, and it shocks me that this is so, particularly if, as I suspect, these reforms may be a stepping stone to the privatisation of at least the large and profitable universities in Australia. Can I get the boring stuff over early? In other words, the facts. In case you haven't kept up to date with the proposals, and they're going to be introduced tomorrow into the House of Representatives, this is essentially what's going on. There's going to be a cut of 20% to the government funding for universities. About 7 of the 20% will be reallocated for HEX places in private providers and for sub-degree programmes not offered by universities. The balance, 14 of the 20, 20% goes to the budget bottom line as an education cut, and it amounts to well over $1 billion across the forward estimates, all of which is being borne by the public universities. So the first headline, if you like, it's a 20% cut to universities, and 14% of it goes to the budget bottom line. The cuts not currently proposed to be evenly applied across disciplines because there's a change in funding clusters as well, so some disciplines will have considerably greater than 20% cut from them. Universities will be allowed to charge Australian students higher contributions, which they can put on their HECS debt to replace the lost Commonwealth income. And on average, domestic student fees will need to increase by 30% to make up the gap, but it'll be considerably higher in a field where more is being cut than the average. But universities will be allowed to go further than what I'm calling replacement, if you like, further than what is necessary to replace the cut income, and they can charge up to the amount that international students pay. In effect, they can charge what the global market will bear. Bruce Chapman, whom you may know, at the ANU, and others have predicted, on the basis of evidence from elsewhere, that student contribution amounts may in fact triple. Now comes the real kicker. HECS debts on these higher fees will be subject to a lower repayment threshold, so students will have to repay them at an earlier point in their earning cycle, and a real interest rate which compounds even when the student or graduate isn't in employment will be applied. And this will apply to existing graduates with debts and current students, not just future enrolled students. So people who could not possibly now rearrange their affairs will be subject to a compound interest rate on the debt they're carrying. The total raised from students over the forward estimates will be $2.5 billion. The University of Canberra has a prominent and successful modelling centre called NatSem, you might have heard of it, and NatSem has modelled for us what the typical effects would be for our courses. And I'm just going to pick out one or two. If the University of Canberra merely replaces the lost income, doesn't charge more than it has to in order to stay in the same place, and imagine a science graduate, and the modelling has been done on average salaries for science graduates. And imagine in particular a female science graduate, then under this scenario, it would take her 13.9 years to pay off her debt, whereas at the moment it's 8.4 years. Her total repayments will increase by an estimated $51,500. So this is just to replace the income that's being taken away. NatSem's modelling has shown that the impact will be felt most strongly for low-pay occupations such as nursing or education, and across the board the impacts are larger for females. An important driver of this, and I'm quoting, is that female income trajectories are impacted by motherhood, which while males enjoy strong growth in incomes through their late 20s, 30s and beyond. Occupations that are dominated by females, such as nursing and teaching, are also occupations with relatively poor prospects for income growth. But what if universities choose to go further than they need to just to replace the cut income? NatSem modelled this on a very modest assumption of 20% more than was necessary, not the doubling or tripling that we've been hearing about, but just 20% more. Take the female science graduate. This would now take 16.4 years to pay off the debt compared to 8.4 at the moment, and her repayments would nearly triple from 44,200 to 123,000 because of the effect of compound interest. As you may have heard famously, Einstein said that one of the most powerful forces in the universe is compound interest, and we're about to experience it. NatSem also says these scenarios don't include single parents who would be in a significantly worse position with a higher interest rate and potentially several years out of the workforce or working part-time and thus not paying off the debt. It will be highly likely that such persons, particularly for high fee and lower income occupations, could be paying off their degrees for well in excess of 20 years. Okay, now I've said that in, I think, a level tone of voice, because I was just trying to get the facts out of the way. Now for what I think. In summary, but I'm going to spell this out, in summary, these changes taken together as a package, in my view, are unfair, they're unethical, they are reckless, they're poor economic policy, they're contrary to the international evidence, they're woefully badly explained, raising suspicions about how much thought has actually gone into them, they're an outrageous breach of pre-election promises, and they're entirely on the wrong track. So I don't really like them. But, yeah, now I'll give you my frank opinion. Okay. So, unfair. And I'll spend most time on this. I think it's the lead argument. They're unfair generally because of the level of indebtedness all students might face, but they're particularly unfair on the disadvantaged, on women, and on those who take career breaks or go overseas. The disadvantaged don't have parents who can pay off or reduce their HECS debts as the student goes along. Remember, the magic of compound interest is that if you can keep the debt down or pay it off, it doesn't apply. If you don't have a parent that can do that for you, the interest keeps compounding. I wrote in the Fairfax media, I wrote it in my blog, and I woke up the next morning to find it in the Fairfax media in full, without my permission, and with a photo. I wrote, "Students seem almost incidental to the debate, but I think they should be at the centre of it. We're about to inflict grievous damage on the prospects of a generation of young Australians by saddling them with enormous debt, and this is being shrugged off as a mildly distasteful consequence. When Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winner for economics and professor at Columbia University, calls on Australia not to take this direction, as he did last month, citing his own country, the USA, as an example of what to avoid, we should listen. And if I have to choose between Stiglitz and Pine, I go for Stiglitz." But even if the worst of the proposals concerning the HECS help scheme is ameliorated, this is the compound interest aspect, fee deregulation will push up the average level of student debt considerably. I said in the Fairfax Press, it has to, because so many universities are supporting fee deregulation in order to fund their future research. Why on earth today's students should fund a university's research tomorrow is quite beyond me. Thank heavens this is Canberra 2014, not Paris 1968. I'm actually not sure I mean that. No. So having reflected further since that blog, the unfairness will become particularly apparent in about 5 years' time, when recent graduates start applying for mortgages and they realise they can't buy a house because of the degree debt that they carry. This is the experience of the United States, and President Obama devoted one of his recent 3-minute weekly videos to this precise problem. Coincidentally, at the weekend, a colleague of mine sent me a newsletter from his financial advisor, quoting a long-established Australian stockbroking company, Baillieu Holst, who predict structural changes in Australian society if the reforms go through. And I'm quoting now, they say that we will price the future generations out of owning their own home for at least a decade. And they say we will lose the smartest candidates to other countries. They also say, I'm quoting, we risk further widening of the inequality gap, as seen in the US with student debt blowouts. And this is from a firm of stockbrokers. The unfairness will become even more apparent when relative graduate salaries decrease because there are more graduates than a knowledge economy needs. I'm going to come back to this. It's a serious sleeper issue. They will be saddled with debt but have lower incomes. Coincidentally, earlier this month, the latest graduate employment figures were released, showing the lowest results since 1993. Only 71.3% of 2013 graduates seeking full-time work had found it at the census date. So, the reforms are unfair to students and doubly unfair to disadvantaged groups. I don't actually believe you need any other arguments, but you're going to get them anyway. So, these reforms are also unethical, in my view. Nothing can ever stay the same. But it's unethical for a generation of leaders who largely went through university free or with much lower student contribution levels to impose the amount of hike on the generations coming behind them so abruptly and so severely. Following Joe Hockey's, let's say, injudicious remarks recently about whether the poor drive cars and if so, how far, there was a Twitter hashtag called "Other Things the Poor Don't Do." It became a kind of hopper or receptacle of just grievance. And they've only been in power since September. So rashly, I put my entry on this hashtag of "Other Things the Poor Don't Do." My entry was, "Kick the ladder away after they get a degree at taxpayers' expense. The poor don't do that." But this is what's happening, courtesy of a cabinet of elites. These reforms are reckless. The worst aspect, extreme fee deregulation, doesn't actually stem from the report that they commissioned. You might have heard of the Kemp-Norton report. But it stems from lobbying by the Group of 8 universities, and in particular from Canberra's own Ian Young, who I know will be the Vice Chancellor of some of you here in the room. Even the National Commission of Audit recommended a 12-month period of debate about this. And the HECS changes have been produced by hopeless amateurs. Why was it only after the government got itself into a corner over the indefensible use of a compounding interest rate that they then took the advice of a world expert who works just around the corner and who designed HECS in the first place, namely Bruce Chapman of the ANU? Another Australian higher education scholar, Simon Marginson, has written that no government anywhere in the world has introduced a full-blown capitalist market in higher education, despite 3 decades of talk, because they realised the public good component of education would be destroyed. And that's because these countries have thought about it. This government hasn't thought about it. These reforms are poor economic policy, particularly from a conservative government's perspective. Recent US research from Penn State University has found a significant negative correlation between changes in student loan debt and the formation of small businesses. Last week in The Australian, I wrote a piece. So enraged was I by another piece that had been written by another Group of 8 Vice-Chancellor in the Kalgoorlie Miner. Now, you may not regularly read the Kalgoorlie Miner, and I don't, to be fair, but it was reissued by the Group of 8 Secretariat, so I thought it was fair game for critique, really. And I said last week, it is worth speculating where this is all going to end. The market will ultimately fail in higher education because students will not keep paying through their fees for the public good component expected of universities, and because some will drift to the institutions who have more taxpayer funds under their belt already, leaving other institutions unviable, particularly in our regional areas. The public good component will diminish painfully, some institutions will go into crisis, electoral politics will kick in, ad hoc rescues will be required, and someone will come up with a bright idea. Why not design a higher education system and regulate it? In the long run, I was really pontificating last week. In the long run, I said, this will happen. But as John Maynard Keynes famously said in 1923, in the long run, we are all dead. The international evidence is against it. If anyone had taken time to evaluate fee deregulation, they would see alarming evidence elsewhere. In the UK, which in some ways now has a scheme more favourable to the student than Australia will have, the Institute for Fiscal Studies has recently found that an average school teacher who has no break in their career will still not have repaid their debt by their early 50s. In the US, student debt has tripled in the last 8 years and now exceeds credit card debt. It was the only kind of debt to keep growing during the GFC because these forces, once unleashed, cannot easily be contained again. The reforms have been poorly explained. Never have I seen such confusion over who is affected and from what date as I saw in the 2 weeks after the May budget. It seemed willfully misleading to deny, as the government did, that the HECS changes would apply to existing students and graduates when it was undoubtedly the case, but they denied it. Charitably, I am putting this under the subheading of poorly explained. They are a breach of a pre-election promise. Now, I hesitated. It's a sad fact, but I hesitated actually even in using this as an argument. I'm not sure that many people care anymore what was promised before an election or whether it's been broken. Perhaps we should just treat election campaigns like the sort of psychological antics that go on before a state of origin game, never to be taken seriously by anyone. But because I care, and I'm outraged at being hoodwinked by a privileged elite, I reckon breach of promise amounts to an argument against the reforms, and I need to spell it out. Last year, the Coalition released a document called Our Plan. The plan was underlined. Real solutions for all Australians. And on the cover were leading coalition figures with chins thrust forward, thus at least symbolising a government that leads with its chin. And at page 41 of Our Plan, unambiguously they say, we will ensure the continuation of the current arrangements of university funding. So if this is continuation, I really wouldn't like to see what they do when they mean to change something. On September the 5th, 2013, 2 days before the election, the ABC interviewed Tony Abbott. The transcript is on the website of the ABC, and it includes the following extract. Tony Abbott says, I can assure your listeners there will be no cuts to health, no cuts to education, no cuts to pension, and so on. No cuts to education. 3 days earlier, Tony Abbott gave a speech, the text of which is still on the Liberal Party website. He said, as Joe Hockey demonstrated last week, the Coalition can more than fund tax cuts without a carbon tax through the sensible savings that were announced months ago. There are no cuts to health, no cuts to education. I realise I'm being naive, but doesn't anyone care about this? Anyway, so I think the reforms are entirely on the wrong track. The government and the Group of Eight have come up with an ideological solution in search of a problem. We have one of the best university systems in the world, and it's about to be trashed. The taxpayer is invoked regularly by the government, but who actually knows if the taxpayer wants public institutions to be competing with each other like this? Maybe they would prefer public bodies to be differentiating and collaborating with each other. This has been the experience in Germany, where the government announced this year that it would abolish tuition fees. The reforms are on the wrong track because higher education is an investment in the economy, not a cost to it. And they're on the wrong track because research should not be funded by students. If you want to engage in an arms race with the US and China over top-ranked universities, which this government seems to want to do, then simply merge the Group of Eight into a single powerhouse institution, and it would shoot into the top 20 in the world. And in a flash of inspiration, I even came up with a name for this new university. I thought you could call it the Australian National University. You would save on 7 Vice Chancellors' salaries and you could leave the rest of us alone. So, I got a laugh with that line when I said it at the ANU Students' Association debate in June. But since then, the latest research-based world rankings have come out. The universities of Melbourne and Queensland and Monash University have moved up in world rankings without fee deregulation. The ANU has slipped further, but that's because it's too small and its previous rankings were propped up by the performance of scholars who left years ago. But I suppose this at least explains why the ANU is in particular so keen to get more money out of students so as to arrest its declining ranking. And the same could be said of the University of Sydney, whose Vice Chancellor has become vocal, including today, since its declining performance was also revealed in these rankings. But there's a different reason why charging students more in order to improve research rankings is plain wrong. It's the difference between ordinal and cardinal numbers. My prediction is that many of our universities will continue to get better, but they will also slip down in rankings and perhaps out of them, as we are displaced by others from countries which throw billions at selected universities of their own, and which also have the gumption to merge institutions and design systems to their advantage in world rankings. You can only have 100 universities in the top 100. Now, let me come back to mergers for a moment. Just Monash and Melbourne, as a single institution, would be a powerhouse. Between them, in the last round of NHMRC project grants, they won 173 grants. The next largest single institutions were Sydney and UQ, which won 130 between them combined. If you want to play fantasy league football with our higher education institutions, then you need to think these kinds of seismic thoughts, rather than land students with a lifetime of debt to stave off an inevitable slippage in rankings. Every industry restructures from time to time when the benefits of recombination outweigh the costs. News Corp recently was trying to take over Time Warner. BHP and Billiton came together. Sadly, by the way, the ANU wouldn't itself add much. It only won 12 NHMRC project grants, despite extra federal funding for the John Curtin School of Medical Research. The reforms are also on the wrong track for a different reason, and this is where I might lose some support, assuming I have some now. There is a possible objection to the reform package which is less newsworthy but might be more profound. Maybe the standard university model is in trouble, and this is even before online education and MOOCs have really hit us. Maybe we're oversupplying the economy with graduates, and because Vice Chancellors don't see this, or don't want to see this, or don't know what to do about it, they may just load students up with debt to paper over the emerging cracks in their business model. Then someone else will have to pick up the mess. My impression is that we've nearly exhausted the eligible population, and we're already doing damage to the vocational sector. We will end up a nation of degree holders who can't find a plumber, unless, of course, they retrain to become one, and probably by then increase their earning power. We may need to reinvent the university as an organisation, but this requires serious, prolonged, frank and evidence-based thinking, not knee-jerk proposals and egregious breach of election promises. It's for another day, and in a way I'm ending this speech on a low note, not a high note, which is obviously very bad speech-making, but I can't just snipe at the government and pretend that there are no problems. There are. But the government is entirely on the wrong track in addressing them, and students should not be the victim of it all. So let me draw this to a close. It's quite possible that there is a package out there which I could agree to, but there is no process to identify it. The government has got itself into a win-lose position, is going to push hard to get it through and compromise to the minimum extent necessary. This does not enable a quite different set of measures to be discussed around research funding, a vision for higher education and so on. In the absence of a forum in which a sensible discussion can occur, and Parliament these days is definitely not it, I refuse to agree to a cent of extra student debt with a gun against my head, whether that gun is in the form of a 20% cut or a savaging of research funding. If there'd been the slightest indication that this was going to happen before the election, then it might have looked different. As it is, I see it as extortion, pure and simple. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the worst piece of policy I've seen in Australia in my 26 years here. And certainly in my 7 years as Vice Chancellor, during which time there have been 7 education ministers, although someone told me recently there might have been 9, God help us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen Parker. So we're going to take some questions from the floor now. So if you'd just like to put your hand up, if you've got a question for Vice Chancellor, I'll hand it over.
It seems that in Parliament no one thinks of the future. And if there were people, even in the coalition, but more specifically outside it, who think of the future, have you identified them?
I haven't. I should say, I've not tried to lobby anyone. I haven't spoken to Clive Palmer and Jackie Lambie. It's fair to say that Christopher Pyne hasn't been speaking to me recently. So I don't actually see myself as a political actor. So maybe I've not been through the processes whereby I might identify people in the coalition that have a similar view. If they've got any sense, the Nationals should be really worried because the university campuses in their constituencies are going to be in deep, deep trouble. So maybe there are some fault lines that I'm just not aware of. But what's really happened is I've just sort of progressively got more narky about the whole thing, given speeches, written pieces, and I've ended up like Robinson Crusoe. It seems I am the only one of 39 Vice-Chancellors that's in this position. But it's emerged, it's not been a deliberate crusade.
You were saying about graduate. There are too many graduates. What would you do what would you suggest to stop that without increasing the funding and making university more exclusive?
This is a really hard one. And I'd remind you that I'm the one putting it on the table. It's not actually in the debate at the moment. But for example, South Korea and Taiwan are now deeply worried they have too many graduates. They don't have enough tradespeople and vocationally trained people. And their graduates are going to jobs and they're dissatisfied. They had expected more. Singapore has now seen that and is trying to pull back on its higher education. And I honestly think that Australia might reach that position. Now, it's not going to reach it in every professional field, so there will always be shortages. I personally didn't really agree with uncapping the higher education system. I thought that having a cap on it and quotas for places allowed an element of person power planning, of planning the future economy. But what's actually happened with the uncapping is that we've handed over the future of the nation's workforce to the distributed preferences of 17-year-olds. So it's a hard one. It's not that I want to deny anyone an opportunity in university, but it's not for everyone. There are people who are struggling in universities. There's a culture getting deeper and deeper that university is the only respectable place to go to, and I think that's really bad. I think it's bad for our society. So, if I had to make a choice here and now, I would go back to some version of the earlier system where there was a cap on places, where that meant that 8 hours or entry qualifications were some kind of rationing device, and I'd have quotas on fields so that we're not oversupplying. It's hard to imagine a country could ever be oversupplied with lawyers, but just theoretically, just in case we're oversupplying particular fields.
Professor Parker, Professor Parker, thank you very much.
Yes,
that was
yes.
a very nice speech. It didn't tell me much that I didn't already know, for the reason that you've been writing blogs and articles in the paper and so forth. So has Ian Young. I'm much closer to you and to him, sentimentally anyway. All the Vice-Chancellors that I've encountered, it's not a very long list, come across as really bright people. That's how they got there. And you're a barrister. If I paid you enough money, what would be the opposite case that you would or simply, what is it about these other 38 or 39 Vice Chancellors that they know that you and I don't?
Okay. Well, I'm speculating. I think there is some real concern amongst some Vice-Chancellors for some aspects of the package. There may be some other Vice-Chancellors that oppose the lot, but we have governing bodies, we have Chancellors. Some Chancellors come from the business community, some come from a political stripe, and maybe it's difficult for some Vice-Chancellors to speak their mind. I have a fantastic Chancellor in Tom Calmer, Australia's first Indigenous man to be a Chancellor, and he and my council fully support this position, and I think it's fair to say I'm proud that the University of Canberra is taking this stance. What would I do if I was paid to advocate this? Do you know, if I was paid to advocate it as is, I'd reject the brief, unless a cab rank rule applied, or something which possibly does to barristers. However, you know, I could advocate a different version of it, because I am open to this. For example, one could look at this in stages. One could, if the government really thinks that the balance between taxpayer and student contribution is in the wrong place, you know, I can't oppose, especially if they mentioned it in the election campaign, I couldn't oppose them sliding the knob across. They could do that. If they wanted to take 20% off university funding and make students just pay 20% more, I'd disagree with it, but you know, I can understand that you've got to draw a line somewhere. But they're taking it off altogether so that a university can more than replace the cut money, but could double or triple. And I didn't say this in my remarks, but the ceiling is the international student fee. But I know of one university that is about to put their international student fees to astronomical levels, knowing that they'll get fewer international students, but so they can gouge domestic students even more. In other words, they can create more headroom. I know that this is going to happen. I could advocate a version where there's a ceiling on HECS debt. There used to be, by the way, when it was first introduced. So that actually operates as a downward price pressure. You know, if a student was not able to carry more than, whatever it is, $80,000 in debt, then a university couldn't charge more, or would know that the students wouldn't be able to put it up on the slate. So, you know, there are things we can do. There are things you can do with the compound interest rate. You could suspend it while someone's unemployed, rather than have the amounts accruing. But this is crashed through politics, and these kinds of options are just not being discussed at the moment. So, getting back to your question, I'd return the brief if I was asked to advocate it as is.
Professor Parker, I'd like to take 2 points up out of your address. First of all, I think you've underestimated the extent of opposition to open-ended university numbers. I know one of the major industry bodies has come out and opposed and said that there are too many people going to university. And some online discussion groups are also highlighting that factor. Your other reference to NatSem doing modelling, do you know whether they've done any modelling on the elasticity impacts of these much higher fee increases on actual revenue numbers? Because it could be that they get a rude shock. They won't get the income that they think they may get.
This gets to the nub of part of it. I'm asked about price or demand elasticity, I suppose it is. We're looking at it. They haven't done the model, but let me say that when I had lunch with Bruce Chapman a few weeks ago, he says no one knows how to do it. So no one knows what the price signal is for a young person who thinks they're immortal, who doesn't have to restart repaying until they reach a certain income level. In other words, the income contingent deferred loan scheme completely dulls the price signal, and no one knows what will happen to elasticity. We tried to engage probably the leading marketing and branding consultant in Australia in higher education to help us model it. She said, I can't do it. I don't know. No one knows. The best she could come up with was you could test the limits with some hero courses, things that you know are in high demand. You could just put them up and up and up and get a sense of where the demand tapers off. But there is no a priori model that enables you to do this. But that is why it's all so reckless, because no one knows.
I'm a bit curious about whether or not anyone's thought about some of the potential unintended consequences of this. And one of them that I know about is that Lincoln University in New Zealand has had an increased number of people making inquiries, Australians making inquiries about their agricultural degree, and I suspect that there are other universities elsewhere that have had the same sort of queries. The other thing is that for Australian women with such a huge debt, I could imagine that fewer would be wanting to have babies.
I'm not at all surprised to hear about, say, Lincoln University, which is very strong in agriculture. And anecdotally, yes, I'm hearing about New Zealand universities who've been through actually a decade of pain themselves, now rubbing their hands at what Australia is inflicting on itself. And there is certainly an increase in UK students studying in the US. Can you believe it? Going to the US to study because it's cheaper, partly because of their very well-developed scholarship scheme, than studying in the UK now, so I don't see why it wouldn't happen here. The impact on women and child-bearing decisions, it's plausible to me. It's very plausible. Yeah, well, this isn't really on your point, but my youngest daughter bought a house recently with her partner, went to the bank where her partner works, and couldn't get the mortgage that they wanted because of their existing combined debt, HEX debt. So imagine what happens when it's double or triple. So you know, this is electoral dynamite. Sorry?
Or you don't work for a bank.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there are plenty of reasons for that, but this is electoral dynamite. It's not yet. You know?
I'd like to congratulate you on an excellent speech, but with both socially responsible ideas and economically responsible ideas. Just to a small point about the Liberal National Party, it seems to me, I don't know what Malcolm Turnbull's view is on this issue, but he seems to be the one front bencher that I could vote for. One other point to make is reading what the VC of Sydney said yesterday, talking about the so-called non-sustainability of the present system. He seemed to be making the same point that you are, that they need to increase student fees in order to fund their research. I wonder, without being offensive, your university probably doesn't do a great deal of research compared with the Big Eight. And now it's always been said, certainly when I was at university, that teachers who do research are better teachers for that reason, understand the issues better. But I'm wondering if it's time to rethink Link, and that we should be thinking in terms of funding research institutes directly from the government rather than via universities. And by all means, university teachers could have conjoint appointments to both of those.
Thank you. Those are very interesting points. It's absolutely true that the University of Canberra's research is not in the league of the Group of 8. I should say, however, last year we entered world rankings in the QS World Rankings, which contains a research measure. So we're a challenger, but we're young. On the teaching research nexus, I've spent most of my academic career believing in that, but the evidence to support it is mixed at best. It's an article of faith, but you will not find a persuasive study that shows that a research active teacher is a research active person is necessarily a bad teacher. But I can show you a lot of researchers who are bloody lousy teachers. So I think it probably is time to have a long, hard look at the teaching research nexus there and to shake off some earlier articles of faith or beliefs. It may be time for teaching-only higher education institutions. Just got to be careful about this. Australia's fourth largest export industry is education. It is the largest service export industry. International students come here, they cross-subsidise our universities, there's a multiplier effect for our economy. They do us good because through interacting with people from other countries, we're practicing for a multicultural world of the future. And part of the demand for Australian universities is because they've got research records and they're in world rankings, as over half the universities are. So from an economic point of view, I'd be careful about having teaching-only institutions. But it's hard to come up with a principled, evidence-based argument that research necessarily makes for better teaching.
I'm just going to step in at that point with my question. I went to a forum, I'm actually an A&D student, I went to a forum with Ian Young recently, and he made exactly the point that you were disputing there, that students benefit by being taught by research-active academics. And this was in response to my question about cross-subsidy, which is great to hear you bringing up, and also Ian Young has been talking about this for some time, although within industry sectors there's something of an open secret, or has been until recently, that student fees pay for research, and it's one of the big risks that you identified, that deregulation might set this loose. Other than capping fees or capping student places, do you see any other way of stopping cross-subsidy and the potential perverse consequences of that?
No, I don't really. And in a way, it's healthy, and universities have got to be left to make some of their own decisions. And whether I agree with Ian Young on that one or not depends on the exact nature of the claim being made. Students greatly benefit from terrific researchers, provided they can teach. They greatly benefit from it. But they don't benefit at all from terrific researchers that can't teach for toffee. So it depends on what the claim is as to whether I agree with him or not. Fundamentally, and maybe I should have said this in answer to the previous question, governments have a responsibility to fund research because it's good for society, it's good for the economy, it makes us innovative. There are plenty of public policy reasons for the taxpayer funding research. I don't believe that students should be gouged for it, even if at the margins, there's some crossover. But what we're looking at is gouging.
Who's coining in the cash?
Who's what, sorry?
Who's coining in the cash? Because it's obviously all about cash.
So would you like to just pass on the mic?
Somebody must be actually profiting from this, because it seems like the government is up for a profit. So somebody's profiting from this. Who is it?
Yeah, cherchez the dollar. Well, the private sector is partly behind it because, although I touched on it, I didn't dwell on it. A form of HEX places will be made available to private higher education providers. So some of the money being taken away from universities is to go to the private providers. So that there's an element of influence happening there, and that's ideologically aligned with what the government wants. The government obviously seems to believe that there's a budget crisis. The 5 top economists in the country don't agree, but the government seems to have said it, and so they're after the cash there. The universities that really feel they can double or triple their fees because they've had decades of public money behind them and now have a brand that they can leverage off, and that there'll be plenty of middle-class students who will incur the debt in order to go and get a degree from that institution. Those universities, they must have cash registers going in front of their eyes. You know, the soundtrack to this is the Pink Floyd track Money. Dum, bum, 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 clink, clink. That's what I think's going on.
Thanks, Stephen, for a really good talk. The part of my question was actually going to be that same one about trying to understand how this would play out for the vocational sector that then wants to enter into the degree sector and the issues around privatisation. But you also mentioned right at the start that you thought there was some other element around privatisation and the long-term implications for our public universities. So I wonder if you'd talk about that a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fear. What do I have to really base it on? Well, firstly, look at the analogue of utilities companies. When many of us were growing up, all utilities companies were in public ownership because there was a belief that the market would fail, and that they had to be above profit-seeking, rent-seeking, and so on. Then what happened? Well, they were told they had to be business-like. And then they were told they had to be competitive, and private providers would come along so that they could benchmark against them, and then they were privatised. And I see a similar kind of trajectory at work here. That's one piece of evidence. The other is that I believe, and I have reason to believe this, that with TAFE institutes there's a privatisation agenda at work in some state governments, and they would be privatised before universities, but once that happens, then that kind of logic will move across to universities. You know, I can't prove this, it's a fear, there's something to base it on.
Right, do we have any other questions? We've got about 10 minutes more for further questions.
Thank you, very interesting talk. I just wanted to ask you whether there would be a brain drain from Australia with people who felt they wouldn't want to pay their debts back and leave in fairly lucrative professions, but they could still, if they came back to Australia, obviously they'd have to pay it, but there may well be people that may do that.
Yeah, I think there will be. I think there probably is a bit at the margins now. You know, if it's a marginal decision whether to take that job in London or that job in Sydney, you know, I could understand the logic. And they're not doing anything wrong, by the way. It's not actually evasion. The debt only applies if you're an Australian taxpayer and your salaries, tax is being collected under PAYG. But I'm sure if the debt is 3 times as high, there'll be a real incentive to go overseas. And that's actually what the stockbrokers newsletter was alluding to.
Just one last one, unless someone else wants. Thank you. I really like that. Students are demonstrating, but do you really think students understand what's involved here? Do you really think people have an idea of what their debt could be and what that could impact on their lives?
I think some are glimpsing it. In the same way that the price signal doesn't really work because they're immortal. You know, it's imperfect. It's refracted, their view of what's to come. But some are seeing it. I get messages of support from students. I had the president of our Students' Association come to see me for a regular meeting, looking very forlorn. He said, "We can't occupy your office because we agree with you." I said, I'm sure he'd think of something down the track. But, so some are seeing it.
Occupy Ian Young's office.
Isn't the main problem that everything's based on the rankings, but the rankings are based on research? So people choose the university because of ranking, but maybe 10% of those actually go into research, but everybody else chooses it, and the rankings are kind of flawed.
Absolutely. The main ranking, the academic rankings of world universities by Shanghai Jiao Tong University, it's an incredible story, really. They were asked to produce these rankings to hold a mirror up against Chinese universities so that those universities would know what they had to do in order to be up there with the best. No one thought this was going to be like a NASDAQ or, you know, some global index, but it's become one. It's heavily skewed towards research, and in particular to scientific research. So, you know, if you've happened to have had a Nobel Prize winner breeze through the place fleetingly, it goes to your rankings. So it's a totally bizarre measure by which to gauge the reputation of an institution, particularly if you're a student and you're going there for a degree. There's noughts a queer as folk, as they say in my home country.
Just as a quick comment, there is an American academic who's been brought to the ANU to publish in American journals writing about American economic issues simply for this fact, because the American economic journals are the ones that attract the highest research ranking metrics.
Not only that, but there are extra points if you publish jointly with international researchers. So everyone's signing up adjuncts around the place. It's rankings-driven madness.
I think we have time for one quick question, if there's any from the floor. At the back, fantastic.
From the comfy seats at the back. Setting aside HECS reforms, just concentrating on fee deregulation, was there ever a scenario where you could have selective deregulation of fees, so the top 8, so that we could have some elite universities competing on the world stage and other universities could attract students that, in other ways?
Yeah, you can have selective forms of deregulation. One of the proposals that actually was doing the rounds, and I had something going for it, was that if a university could demonstrate, it didn't have to be a group of 8 by the way, but because there are some pockets of excellence by the way in other universities, if a university that could demonstrate that it had a really excellent discipline in X should be allowed to charge more, and then you could experiment with it and see how high they went. So you could develop some reasonably objective measures about the strength of teaching in a particular discipline, based on demand for entry, student feedback, graduate employment rates, graduate starting salaries, and then you could say, yeah, look, this is a premium course, and this university can charge X% more, and then we'll see how it goes. All of that was possible, but it just landed. I was in the budget lockup for education on budget night. I was sitting with people who are tea leaf readers in higher education. There wasn't a single person in that room that expected this to come unless they were already in the know. So it's come about, I think, in a reckless way.
And of course, with the crossbench saying, at least at this stage, that it's going to oppose the package, it's very hard to expect what's going to come next. But at this point, please thank with me Professor Stephen Parker.